Now, whether you're reading this as an email attachment or listening to my recording on YouTube, I hope this message finds you and your family both healthy and safe. I miss seeing all of you and look forward to the day when we can gather once again as the Hope Lutheran Church family. This has been the most disruptive moment in all of our lives, of course, and it's not even over yet, not by a long shot. Maybe you were like me and thought that a couple months ago that this summer it would all be over, but it isn't. We're being forced to respond to a new normal. As more and more time goes by, the less likely it is that we'll ever return to how things were before. I know and understand how each of you has been forced to adapt to all these changes in your daily lives and in your professional lives. Well, as you can imagine, it's the same here at church and for me and the other members of our HLC staff as well. 2 months ago, I wrote and then recorded a message to the congregation describing our initial response to the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, much has happened since then, including recent announcements from both President Trump and Governor Murphy about the reopening of churches. And so I felt that it was time to give you an update on where things currently stand and what you could reasonably expect to happen in the near future. First, I'll give you a brief general overview of where we're at, and then I'll respond directly to the question of reopening, which I'm sure is on everyone's mind. As of today, Friday, June 5th, our building still remains closed. Hope Christian School, for example, has not reopened. In fact, this would have been their final week of classes, and all we could do for graduation was a drive-by in the church parking lot this morning. Nor have there been any meetings or activities conducted during this period of time, either by the various outside groups who use our facility or even our own Hope Lutheran Church committees and organizations. In addition, for now, I'm still the only member of the staff who comes in on a daily basis. I can tell you I certainly enjoy the peace and quiet for the most part, but it does get a little lonely at times. And Cheryl and Josh and Judy, on the other hand, continue to work primarily from home, only coming into church when necessary. We've even recently started doing staff meetings on Zoom. However, Diane and Wayne Kless do come in at least several times a week and are taking advantage of the current situation to do some deep cleaning and organizing. Worship, of course, continues to be live streamed on Sunday mornings at 9:30 a.m. and is available on either YouTube or Facebook and then accessible thereafter on our Hope Lutheran YouTube channel. The response has been nothing short of amazing. In the 10 weeks since our worship services have been exclusively online, our weekly attendance has literally exploded, growing from an average of 118 worshipers per week to 271, a 130% increase. And while worship attendance has dipped slightly since Holy Week and Easter is to be expected, we still average just under 200, 198 to be precise. You should also know that we feel pretty comfortable about these numbers because Josh is able to analyze exactly how many views there have been on YouTube and Facebook, and then even calculate how many of those watch the entire or nearly the entire service. And we then multiply that number by 2 in order to take into account that the vast majority of those viewing are probably not watching alone. And so we were pleased, actually, to learn that the ELCA has confirmed our method of counting worshipers, although they do allow for congregations to count every online view, not just those who've watched the majority of the service as we do. Our averages would have been even higher if we'd gone ahead and used the ELCA recommendation, but Josh and I feel much more comfortable with our more conservative estimates. A related issue, of course, is that of financial giving or offerings. First, I want to thank all of you who have been able to continue giving in this difficult time, whether by mailing in or dropping off your offering envelopes at church or using one of the online platforms, PayPal or Tidely. Despite the fact that we've not been able to gather in person to worship for the past 10 weeks, our offerings are nevertheless slightly ahead of where they were at the same point last year. Furthermore, approximately 10% of those offerings have been received through online giving. And I also need to share with you that we're even receiving offerings from non-members as well, who have begun watching our live streaming and online worship services. That's pretty remarkable. On the downside, I need to remind everyone once again that our estimated or hoped for offerings in the budget or spending plan do not by themselves cover the entirety of our church-related expenses. In recent years, though, we've been blessed by the financial success of Hope Christian School, which brings in far more money than it actually spends to run its program. And this profit then, for lack of a better term, is what then makes up for the shortfall in our offerings. In fact, after all the expenses for both the church and the school are covered, there's even money left over, a considerable sum in recent years actually, which we've then been saving for future projects and initiatives, including some much needed repairs. For example, some long overdue repair work to a couple of the worst potholes in the parking lot was recently completed. And after nearly 2 years of investigation and planning and some dedicated efforts by a number of our members, including most recently John Bonanno, the electric baseboard heaters in the preschool classrooms are all being replaced, hopefully later this month, by a more efficient and safer system. The congregation had previously approved up to $150,000 for this project, but again, through some good research and planning, the actual cost will only be $105,000. Still a considerable sum to be sure. But we've been able to save a good deal of money in recent years and now have it available to pay for this improvement to our facility. But as I said earlier, Hope Christian School had to close its doors back in mid-March. And this means that we've not received any tuition income during that time period either. We've benefited, however, from receiving one of those PPP or Paycheck Protection Program loans through the Small Business Administration, a loan which will be forgiven in full if we use 75% of the money on payroll. And it looks like we're going to meet or come very close to meeting that requirement, which means that little or nothing will have to be repaid. Nevertheless, moving forward, we will undoubtedly be running a deficit for the next few months, especially if we're not able to conduct our successful summer camp program, which also provides additional income. A decision on that will most likely be made any day now once the state-mandated requirements for camps are finally released. And we still don't know what kind of restrictions or limitations we'll be facing in the fall when Hope Christian School is scheduled to begin a new academic year. There's certainly a possibility that we'll not be able to enroll as many children as we have in the past, which again will impact our overall income and the congregation's financial bottom line, which is all the more reason why your continued giving is so critically important at this time, especially until Hope Christian School reopens in the fall and tuition payments resume. Well, having shared this brief overview of our current situation, which under the circumstances is actually surprisingly good, I want to turn now to the burning question on everyone's mind. When will Hope be reopening, especially for in-person worship? Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Despite the announcements from both the president and our governor, there are no clear directives as of yet about how this can and will take place. In particular, the limits to indoor and outdoor gatherings, a maximum of 10 people indoors and 25 people outdoors, are still in effect here in New Jersey at this time. Until these change or are modified, which may come as soon as the next few days, it would be extremely difficult to plan and conduct any kind of worship. That's the first thing to note. Secondly, a go-ahead from state or federal authorities is not the only thing to take into consideration. As anxious and excited about returning to in-person gatherings as many of us are, there are a host of other important issues to be considered and evaluated before we can do that. The ELCA has even issued a helpful guideline entitled Considerations for Returning to In-Person Worship. Let me briefly highlight for you the main points of this document in order of importance, and beginning with what I think is most important, that being the safety of the community and the congregation. Of paramount concern to all of us should be the health and safety of our members and worshipers always. In my sermon this past Sunday, I referenced that early super spreader event in the state of Washington in which 52 of 60 choir members at a rehearsal were infected with the virus. 3 were eventually hospitalized and 2 of them actually died. The last thing, the very last thing that we want to do is anything that might endanger or compromise someone's health. as our Bishop Tracy Bartholomew has pointed out, many of our members, especially our most active worshipers, are older and possess the kind of risk factors and underlying health conditions that make them more susceptible and especially vulnerable to the coronavirus. These folks should not be worshiping in person anytime soon. But they're not the only ones at risk. Younger, seemingly healthy individuals have also fallen prey to COVID-19. And so certain precautions will have to be considered, and many of them implemented, as medical doctors and healthcare professionals have been suggesting all along. Among them are requiring masks, social distancing, no passing of the peace, no collection of an offering, or distribution of communion, or use of hymnals and bulletins, and also then cleaning and disinfecting the entire worship area and the restrooms after every service. Also, frequent use of hand sanitizers, limiting restroom use to one person at a time, possibly even banning singing entirely, because as in that Washington Choir super spreader event, respiratory droplets exhaled during singing is one of the chief ways that this virus can be transmitted. In fact, the Wisconsin Council of Churches has even suggested that there be no in-person congregational singing until a vaccine for COVID-19 becomes available. Obviously, there's a lot for us to think about here. And then there's the state and federal guidelines. As I've already mentioned, there continues to be strict limitations on the number of people who can gather both inside and outside. Assuming that these limits are eventually relaxed and expanded, and that the suggested precautions listed above are followed, still a good bit of planning will have to precede any in-person worship services. How many services will be required to accommodate everyone who wants to worship? How will the facility be cleaned and disinfected in between services? I've even seen suggestions for filling the front pews or seats first, but Lutheran's going to want to do that, and then dismissing the back pews or seats first, so as to cut down on people walking past each other. It all sounds a little extreme, I know, but these are the kinds of issues being explored and debated right now. And then there's recommendations from the ELCA and the Synod Office. In addition to all of the above, the ELCA is currently discouraging gathering for worship until the restrictions on the number of people gathering has been expanded to 50 people and above. And even then, however, all the sanitation, cleaning, and hygiene measures listed above should remain in effect. And then there's recommendations from our insurance carrier and policy. The health and safety of worshipers is first and foremost, obviously, but reopening will probably also have legal and liability implications as well. What happens if someone gets sick? Are we covered? What kinds of other actions will we be required or expected to take by our insurance company in addition to all of the above? One of the things that Cheryl has discovered in talking with our insurance company in recent days is that they're apparently willing to pay for a deep cleaning of the facility prior to our reopening. That'd be a very good thing to take them up on, particularly if it demonstrates that we've taken every step to reopen responsibly. Well, now some personal thoughts. My own take on the issue of reopening is that we should move cautiously and prudently. This is not something to be hurried. Churches in Texas and Arkansas and Georgia have been in the news recently when they had to close once again after worshipers, including clergy, were infected after reopening their doors. Again, the health and safety of people always needs to be our chief concern in any decisions we make. And having said that, I know that there are people who want us to reopen, especially for worship, as soon as possible. In fact, national surveys to date have shown that as many as 31% of people are ready and willing to gather for in-person worship as soon as it's made available. However, another 24% indicate that they'll most likely wait for a little bit. Additionally, 95% fully expect that there's going to be some sort of safety precautions and accommodations in place. And a small number of people, 7% as I recall, will not be comfortable coming back to worship at all until there's a vaccine available for the coronavirus. Here are several things I think we can expect. First, not everyone will be ready and willing to come back for in-person worship, even when we as a congregation decides that it's safe to do so. That's just a fact. Those of us who are most vulnerable, the elderly, those with underlying health conditions, etc., may and probably should decide not to worship until the risk of contracting the coronavirus has been completely eliminated. For that reason, live streaming our worship service and uploading it to our Hope YouTube channel is here to stay. But even when the risk posed by the coronavirus has finally passed, live streaming the worship will have become a new normal. In other words, we'll continue to do it. In fact, it's even been suggested that many churches will pre-record and upload their worship services to be accessed and watched at any time, and then use Sunday mornings for a much more creative and interactive experience than just sitting and listening to a choir sing and a pastor preach. Given the popularity of on-demand and streaming options for TV and movies, I think there may be some truth to this. And it'll be interesting to see what develops and how we might even consider doing ministry here at Hope in response to this possibility. I also agree with those who were saying that the coronavirus pandemic is not an interruption, but a disruption. In other words, there will be no going back to the way things used to be. Like I said, live streaming is just one way in which change in the church and in the world is being accelerated by the pandemic. Nevertheless, in considering our own situation here at Hope, I think it's safe to say that we will not be reopening for worship on June 14th, as Governor Murphy has suggested. It's just too soon, I believe. And we still don't know what the new limits and restrictions are going to be. Moreover, given the fact that we anticipate the replacement of those electric baseboard heaters in the classrooms to take place later this month, it's doubtful that we can even consider reopening before July at the earliest. And then there are all the aforementioned guidelines to be considered and implemented as well. And so it will require some time and reflection on the part of our congregation council in order to make the best possible decisions. So stay tuned. A final thought. On Sunday, on my way home from church, I stopped in at the Acme across Route 9 for a few groceries. And as I was checking out, an older gentleman who was behind me asked if I was a member of the clergy. I guess the collar and the black suit coat were a dead giveaway. Anyway, I said that I was, and he proceeded to ask me if my church was open for worship. And I told him no, we were live streaming and uploading it online. And then he said, "What do you think about that Supreme Court decision? Wasn't that terrible?" He was referring, of course, to their recent decision to reject an emergency appeal by a California church challenging the state's limits on attendance at religious services. And I thought about it for a second. And then I said, well, my first and primary concern will always be to protect the health and safety of my members who come to worship. Well, he seemed to understand and agree with that, and that's where we left it. To me, the question about reopening always has to be considered in light of what's best for the most people. As you know, some folks are framing this as a question of freedom. Restricting their ability to worship as they please is an infringement on that freedom they feel. Well, I totally disagree. Freedom, especially in this instance, must always be a secondary issue to loving our neighbor. If restricting gatherings helps us to slow the spread of this disease and can thereby help save lives, then this is something that we as Christians should be committing ourselves to immediately and wholeheartedly. Let me leave you for now with a couple of scriptures where the Apostle Paul describes this far better than I ever could. He writes, "I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others." 1 Corinthians 10, verses 23 and 24. And also, "For you are called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another, for the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Galatians 5, verses 13 and 14. Blessings to you and your families during this challenging and difficult time. I have no doubt that we'll get through this together with God's help and guidance. God's peace. Take care and be well.